of water to its slopes, and the life zones or biological communities are gone on into in great detail, and how they change with elevation going up the mountain. And then finally, some on the days ahead, the dry and warm days ahead, and what some of the implications are for that. But first, some perspective. I love this picture. As you can see, the west coast of North and Central America is largely a band of mottled gray. And those are indeed mountain ranges that were crunched and distorted and deformed by endless tectonic action between the Pacific plate, crunching in on the western edge of the North American plate, just cramming everything together and creating mountain ranges. And the Pacific plate actually dipped down below the North American plate at one point, what they call subducting. It went shallowly under it, and that led to the uprising of the Rocky Mountains and the Colorado Plateau, among other geologic formations. So this wonderful band of land is referred to as the Western Cordillera. I like to think of it personally as the Western Plant Highway. And for millions of years, plants and surely animals have migrated up and down these ranges in response to endless changes in climate. It's pretty darned amazing. So anyway, yay plate tectonics. Okay, getting in a little closer, the San Francisco Volcanic Field, of which the Peaks is kind of the crown jewel in a way, is comprised of more than 600 volcanoes. Nearly all of them are simple cinder cones that go off once, you know, send some lava out, and then they're done. Other kinds of volcanoes include lava domes, such as Bill Williams, Sitgreaves, and Kendrick Mountains, and also Dry Lake Hills and Eldon. And then the most complex of all, of course, is the Peaks, which is a stratovolcano, which was built of multiple flows. There are more than 70 volcanic vents that were associated with it at one time. And multiple eruptions leading to its condition. It's also interesting to note that this process has been what they called a younging event, so that the western part of this volcanic field, the volcanoes contained within it are quite a bit older than those that occur on the eastern edge. The youngest of all known now is Sunset Crater, east of the San Francisco Peaks, which is a little over 900 years old. So it's a younging event. And presumably, if there are more volcanoes erupting in this field, they may well be on the eastern edge of the whole thing. We shall see. And then the Peaks itself. Research has been going on this mountain for centuries. In the early 1900s, a man by the name of H.H. Robinson studied the geology of the Peaks, and the upper image here is really his design and execution, showing what he thought would have been an earlier cone associated with the mountain, kind of a Mount Fuji-like form, if you will. And I think it's impressive. He had, zero access to much in the way of maps or any kind of aerial imagery. And to be able to conclude that, it seems pretty clever to me. In any event, nobody knows what happened to the cone. There are strong feelings about it, and there have been a lot of debates. Some people feel that it probably collapsed pure and simply in a cold debris avalanche. With no, volcanic fanfare at all, whereas other volcanologists, if you will, feel that it had to have come down with some kind of a volcanic collapse kind of event that would have blown it up a bit. And hopefully we'll find out one of these days. This lower image shows you what Flagstaff, the peaks from Flagstaff might have looked like if the cone had not gone away. So that would have been nice. Anyway, so here we are again looking down on the mountain, and between Robinson and later geologists, all of the lava flows have been mapped, and most of them have been dated at this point, which is fantastic to really sort of line out the history of this story. What this image shows, I think most importantly, is great evidence for the peaks having had a tall single cone at one point. And that's evidenced by this light pink layer and a young andesite layer that dated to about 500,000 years old. So if you look, you can see that there's evidence of its lava having flowed nearly all the way around the mountain, suggesting very strongly that it had to have erupted from a tall central cone to make such a distribution. One other thing, a couple other interesting notes here. The oldest visible little subvolcano within the peaks here in blue is North Sugarloaf. And that you can see on the drive up to Locket Meadow, but you actually drive across its flanks. But it is dated as the oldest, at least visible cone within the peaks. And that date came in at 2.8 million years old. And then right next to it, amazingly, is the youngest volcano within the mountain, which is called Sugarloaf. And that, that's the yellow one here. And that dates to a mere 90,000 years ago. So it was still pretty active until fairly recently. Again, notice the inner basin here and how kind of blown out it is, suggesting that some major erosion has occurred since the last time lava flowed from the top cone. So anyway, that's pretty amazing stuff. And again, there are more than 70 vents associated with these flows, and a range of 2.8 to 90 million years to 90,000 years, saying very strongly that the building of this mountain and its ecosystems was very much a process of the Pleistocene, our last ice age, that really only ended about 10,000 years ago. And just makes the story all the more incredible, I think, to imagine those incredibly bitter, wild, wild times. So, an ice age mountain indeed. This perspective is in the inner basin, in that carved out part of the peaks, which you saw on the last slide. And this is looking down valley to the east. So from the flanks of Agassiz Peak all the way down through the inner basin, you can see some leftovers of the Pleistocene. There were at least 3 glaciers in the inner basin in the last 90,000 years. And glaciers are pretty amazing things. They start in the tops of mountains in the super steep head walls and begin to form as snow becomes compressed into ice. And as that happens, glaciers grow and with gravity begin to flow as frozen ice, if you will, down valley of mountains. And as they go, these massive, massive blocks of ice, they push debris, rocks, boulders down to sand, every kind of particle imaginable ahead of them, creating these leftover remnants, these rock piles, which are called moraines. And it's a great record of what happened, of the extent of glaciers and all, that is very visible long after they've melted away. And you can see the arrows here. With the arrows here, some are pointed out. Here's one at the mid-range right here. And they're all rather rounded and undulating, if you will. There are more here and here. This is the center part of the inner basin here, kind of the narrowest. And a lot of moraines really just kind of piled up here, with some of these deposits being more than 500 feet tall, which is quite impressive. They were actually thought to have been lakes, glacial lakes formed up behind them. Incredible, incredible stuff. It's worth noting that during this time, full-on glacial conditions, the last ice age, a lake near Flagstaff called Potato Lake, it's about 40 miles away, was filling with sediment and stuff, and was sampled in the last 10 years. They were able to isolate sediment from 30 to 15,000 years ago, and showed that at that time, the forests around Potato Lake, as well as around the peaks, were largely dominated by high elevation spruces, Engelmann spruce, which normally occurs at about 10,000 feet on the mountain. So the world was changing. Plants were moving down. They were moving away. Engelmann spruce, or a relative of it, which lived in the peaks, made it all the way to southern Mexico, riding on the cold. So it was a time of great migrations. Not only that, but a lot of the 90 species of tundra plants, those that live above tree line in the peaks, made it to the mountain during this cold time. And some of them came from as far away as the Arctic, which will always manage to blow my mind. Okay, and just another sort of show of the moraines mapped out here from the 3 different glacial events that we know of. It's important to note that these moraines are essentially aquifers in the inner basin. They're perched aquifers with enormous masses of rock, and you can see literally all of the springs in the inner basin hail from moraines. Not only that, but the city of Flagstaff tapped into some of these in the late 1800s and early 1900s and established a pipeline system to harvest water and provide it for Flagstaff. And for a time, 90% of Flagstaff's water came from the aquifers, AKA moraines, in the inner basin. So that's kind of wild too, as sources of water. And then this is the core ridge moraine, the one in the center of the inner basin. And you can see how steep it is and how lush it is. The peaks, the mountain doesn't have a lot of soil, so moraines help to generate some, and aspens and all their understory associates are totally hogging these sites, and it's just wonderful. Again, more than 500 feet tall. All righty, there are also avalanches in the peaks. They tend to occur high up on the mountain in the higher spruce fir zones. There are over 70 avalanche chutes in the peaks. And a 1980 study showed that the avalanches averaged about 50 a year, which is very similar to what occurs in the Rocky Mountains. And they're a major form of disturbance in the spruce fir zone. As you can imagine, I was hiking Snowslide Canyon on this day in June 2015, and lo and behold, there was a total corridor of snow with lots of shredded spruce and fir all the way down the pike. So it's a pretty big deal. And another avalanche chute, Telemark, is at the base of what's called Fremont Peak, one of the southern peaks of the San Francisco peaks. And it sends down lots of rock debris as well as snow seasonally. And as a consequence, it's kind of created its own wonderful little rock pile / aquifer here, which supports a population of schooler willow, which is the largest willow population in this mountain. So that's a wonderful little habitat there. Major, major impacts of avalanches here. So it's important to imagine this mountain as having been built in glacial phases, and they came and went. I mean, it must have been an absolutely wild ride. While most of the Pleistocene was thought to have been comprised of super cold times, there were interglacial phases that were practically Dust Bowl-like. So trying to imagine anything getting established anywhere is pretty challenging, really, in these incredibly dynamic and extreme times. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about people. So this point was found, it's an Eden-style point, found at Bismarck Lake on the west flank of the San Francisco peaks, and it dates between approximately its creation, its honing, 7,000 to 9,000 years ago. And it was carved for hunting big animals. And this seems like a good time to mention that, you know, up to 10 to 12,000 years ago, the Pleistocene megafauna, the big animals, were here. There are records for them all over Arizona, in fossil beds in the southern part of the state, in caves in Grand Canyon, and even along the Little Colorado, they find fossils of things like mastodons and mammoths and short-faced bears and saber-toothed tigers and rhinos and camels and over 20 species of horses, and just phenomenal animals that kind of went away with the end of the Pleistocene too. And anyway, it must have been quite an amazing time in this part of the world to have seen all of this stuff. Okay, and then at the end of the Pleistocene, 10 to 12,000 years ago, really not that long ago, the world changed and began drying out again for the Holocene, which we're still in now, a very dry time. This photo was taken from the road to Tuba City, looking back at the peaks. And, you know, try to imagine a high elevation plant migrating across that field to get to the peaks. Probably wouldn't have worked out. This isolation with the end of the Pleistocene has led to at least 30 species of plants occurring only on the San Francisco peaks in Arizona. So they're very isolated, and here's hoping for the future. All righty, with the book, we also mapped out the vegetation zones according to the shape of the peaks itself. This is the first time a three-dimensional vegetation map has been made for this mountain, so that was way overdue to give it the most accurate kind of rendering possible. And you can see along the base is ponderosa pines, and this is really just a very small subset of ponderosa pines, enormous western distribution. Not surprisingly, the greatest number of species of plants occur in it, as they occur throughout its range through the west. And then with an increase in elevation, the next is the mixed conifer zone, which is very kind of thin and fragile looking almost, this blue. And it grades into aspens, which have an enormous presence on the mountain still, which is wonderful, and are just so kind to the world. And then on up into the spruce fir zone, ever steeper and smaller. And then finally, the little gray zone here really is the tundra, which accounts for a mere 1,200 acres, which is pretty amazing because what we found was that there were more species of tundra plants per acre than plants found in any other zone. So So there's a lot happening up there too, and it's pretty darned amazing. There are 3 species of plants that we know of that are endemic to the peaks. And that means that they occur nowhere else on Earth. So that's a very special thing and to be expected when considering a sky island. And now these populations have been isolated from related populations, the higher elevation ones anyway, for more than 10,000 years. All right, and now for one of my absolute favorite pictures of all. So in the 1880s, Seahart Merriam, a biologist from back east, came out west to try to understand how agriculture might work in the West as it was still getting colonized. And he also was just really interested in the way vegetation is distributed. It was a big topic of the 1800s. And he felt that the San Francisco peaks would be perfect because it was this beautifully shaped island with what appeared to be very clear, different zones of vegetation. So the life zones are kind of named after him, really, or for his work. The lowest, again, being ponderosa pine, kind of dense and then more open in places. And then the mixed conifer zone here, all mushed in with aspens. And what a presence that is, huh? All the way around the mountain, just a phenomenal thing. And then up above that, still climbing, is the spruce fir zone, this very dark, dense spruce and fir dominated zone, up to about 11,500 feet. And then above that is the tundra, the land above tree line, which is in some ways just so amazing and improbable. In this area, the tundra zone comprises a mere 1,200 acres. So it's really not very big at all. So ponderosa pine zone, boom, here we are. This plant is known to the West for at least 50 million years. The earliest record for ponderosa pine fossil-wise is from a find in British Columbia about 50 million years ago. It's a yellow pine. It's a very dynamic history in the West. Ponderosa pine occurs along the California ranges as well as throughout the Rockies. And there are great divisions of, different races of ponderosa pines, with the coastal varieties being less or faster growing and less tolerant of drought. And by comparison, our ponderosa pine, the one of the Rockies and Intermountain West on down, are far more drought tolerant and more slow growing. In the last 125 years, with human intervention, ponderosa pine's densities on and around the peaks have increased by more than 1,000%. Because of lack of fire primarily, and leading to dog hair thickets such as these, which are incredibly flammable and low in diversity and just really unhealthy. So, but there's great science at NAU now, and these kinds of stands are being carved out and opened up as they occur, and it's very exciting to see that, to return them to what they call pre-settlement conditions, where they were much more open and diverse with understory grasses and flowers and shrubs and all. Some of the neatest grasses I find in ponderosa pine stands are mutton grass, which is a cool season bluegrass, and also a warm season grass called blue grama grass, which is one of the most drought hardy grasses in Western North America. So that's kind of cool. And then on to the mixed conifer zone, where things really get interesting. Tom Kolb, who's a forest ecologist at NAU, refers to the mixed conifer zone as the sweet spot on the peaks. And that's because even though it occurs at a higher elevation than ponderosa pines, It's actually warmer, which is really nice in the winter, as well as getting a lot more precipitation like higher elevation sites do. And the reason for this is that at night, when the land of the peaks cools, cold air rushes down its slopes and settles in the lowland valleys all around it, which is where most ponderosa pines occur. So it really does get quite a bit colder. Because of warmer temperatures and a fair amount of moisture, ponderosa, or the mixed conifer zone, is regarded as one of the most productive habitats in the peaks. And that's true for its presence in a lot of other southwestern mountains as well. It also has the greatest diversity of species of conifers, including Doug fir, white fir, blue spruce, and limber pine and southwest white pine, which have a really interesting relationship there. They both meet. Limber pine sort of comes down from the Rockies. Southwestern white pine has expanded its range up from Mexico, and they meet in the San Francisco peaks and they hybridize. And they also meet and hybridize in a number of mountains in New Mexico as well. So it's the whole region is kind of a big hybrid zone for them. And, you know, they both are very different, one being more northerly, the other more southerly. And in the days ahead, this exchange of genes may be just absolutely fabulous for keeping them in tune with where the climate is going and perhaps best adapted to handle it. So that's kind of exciting. And then aspens. When people write about life zones, they often just roll aspens into the mixed conifer zone or the zones above. But my way of thinking, and other people that I studied, is that aspens in and of themselves are so important that they deserve to kind of stand on their own. This species is the most widely distributed deciduous tree in North America. It is clonal. It's, you know, very often you look at an aspen stand and you're looking at one individual. They photosynthesize through their bark, particularly on south-facing borders, and also in winter when they have no canopy to obscure the bark. So they're very economical about all that. They are clonal and can send up new shoots within a week or two after a fire comes through an area. So they're very well adapted to handle fire and to take advantage of it when it burns conifers away. And by virtue of its soft wood, its very wet leaves and all, which all come down, you know, each year, lots of branches and leaves, they're very readily recycled, nutrients, water, all of it. And as a result, they support an inordinate number of species of plants and animals. Next to riparian habitats in the Western US, aspens are thought to support a greater biodiversity than other habitat types. So they are really important in the world as we know it, and it's hard to imagine them not being around. Another major player in the peaks that kind of transcends different zones and is well worth mentioning is called Nevada pea. And I'll bet you've all seen it when you were hiking up in the Inner Basin or something. This delicate little pea, Lazarus lanzertii, like many members of the pea family, fixes nitrogen. And what that means is that this pea has bacteria associated with its roots, which are actually able to draw nitrogen from the air, which is very unusual. And with that, they can get nitrogen to all kinds of plants surrounding them and help forests to thrive. And they're very common, very well represented on many of the southwestern volcanic mountains that we know and love. And then onto the spruce fir zone, getting ever steeper. These are the highest elevation forests in North America, mostly on super steep slopes. And let's see, they are extensions really of the boreal forests of Canada. Both Engelmann spruce and corkbark fir, which make up our spruce fir forests, are related to prominent spruce fir species in the in boreal forests in Canada. So it's all just stuff moving around in response to climate, which is pretty amazing. And there are also these endless forests of these two species, very important carbon sinks, which we need more and more of these days to pull in excess carbon from the atmosphere. And in the inner basin, Engelmann spruce and corkbark fir form wonderful stands with aspens around meadows there. And they're just so lush and beautiful, it's crazy. You should go there as soon as you can. Engelmann spruce here in the top is a dominant spruce throughout the western mountains of the United States. And this sort of relative, again, made it all the way to Mexico when it was cold, and they were able to expand their ranges in that direction. There are now several spruce offshoots of these guys, different species, that are going extinct or threatened there, although they have found a species of spruce, excuse me, in Mexico that's actually more tolerant of heat and drought than most other spruce species known. So evolution is happening, and it's pretty darned amazing. Corkbark fir, the other part of this pair, is also fascinating. It's also an offshoot of subalpine fir, which is an offshoot of the boreal firs as well. What's interesting about corkbark is that it has a really tiny range, smaller than most any of the other conifers we've talked about. It occurs, in the peaks, a little bit elsewhere in Arizona and New Mexico, and a tiny bit in southern Colorado. What's interesting is that it has really thick bark, which is absolutely unusual for high elevation conifers, where fire is rarely a factor. So the thinking is that the thick bark on this species may have enabled it, if you will, to live in the arid Southwest as it does, and be more tolerant of aridity and heat. If I were about 1 million years younger, I would take this study on. I think it'd be really fun. Anyway, so there's that. And then just one species, one of the 4 orchids that occurs in the peaks, the fairy slipper orchid, I saw one day walking along the edges of this meadow, and they were tucked under some Engelmann spruce trees. Again, migrations, things migrating to the mountain with the cold, and then on further south into the deserts and into Mexico. What a wild time it was. Okay, another fabulous tree is bristlecone pine. This is different than the species that occurs in the Great Basin. Those species are, known to exceed 4,000 and 5,000 years in age. The population of bristlecone pine in the peaks occurs near the top. This guy, this wonderful windswept kind of iconic form, these have been dated at 1,500 years of age. So they're at least that old. And interesting and somewhat enigmatically, these guys are starting to move down to lower elevations in the inner basin and also on Hart Prairie on the west side of the peaks. And where they are coming in at these lower elevations, they're incredibly happy, occurring in wide open wet meadows, and their growth rings on the bands on their trunks are absolutely massive, indicating species that are going hog wild. So that's kind of interesting. I'd like to add also that this particular species of bristlecone pine occurs nowhere else in Arizona. So that's always kind of interesting to mull over. How on earth did it get here? And when? All righty, and then up to the top of the stack, excuse me, the tundra, life above tree line, 11,500 to 12,633. They go literally all the way to the top. And there are two major habitats in the peaks for plants living above tree line. One are these, include the majority are scree fields or fell fields like these, which are very loose, unstable, rocky slopes that sometimes the plants can hold in place a little bit. They're very rough, very windy, very dry. William Billings, a tundra ecologist, once referred to plants living above tree line in the Western United States as being desert survivors. They're incredibly brutal landscapes, ironically, more so than those that can be found in the Arctic. The other habitat in the peaks is the alpine meadow. And you can see this one here, it's just tucked inside the inner basin, so a little less exposed to wind and all. And there behind that KSB sign, there's a snowbank that's melting and bringing water to this wonderful little place. And again, the plants of the tundra are more diverse per acre than those of the other plant zones below, which is kind of cool. And remember too that a quarter of these species, these tiny little pore dispersing species, made it from the Arctic to the peaks. And some of the players, nearly all of these guys occur only in the peaks in Arizona, and they are mostly very small. Few of them exceed 6 inches in height. The first upper left is Perry's primrose, which is fabulous. And that occurs throughout a lot of the upper zones of the peaks, as well as in the Rockies. Moss campion occurs all around the top of the northern hemisphere in the Arctic and major continents at northern latitudes, and then also stretches like the conifers do down the mountain highway and made it to the peaks too. They're hundreds of miles away from related populations. The same goes for sticky polemonium. This guy, San Francisco ragwort, excuse me, is endemic to the mountain and hanging in there. It really likes highly disturbed cinder sites. So that seems like a pretty good fit. And again, as an endemic, it occurs nowhere else on Earth. Pink stone crop and also Ross's avens are major representatives of tundra habitats. And they're all just beautiful. There's nothing more wonderful than looking at them, although you have to kind of get down on the ground because they really are very tiny. And it's just a miracle to see them and to imagine they're migrating here. Okay, need to kind of pick it up here. I know I'm going over. All right, so animals, just a little bit. The greater short-horned lizard has been found at 10,000 feet. The American pipit, this guy, the wonderful bird, center top, is a tundra breeding species and migrates down from the Rockies to the peaks every year to mate, to breed, to nest in the tundra of the peaks. I just can't feature it. You know, heading out for this tiny spire in the middle of nowhere to call home for the growing season is pretty profound. Clark's nutcracker is a seed harvester, has a special pouch, a sublingual pouch, so it can load up on limber pine and southwest white pine seeds. and it competes fiercely with the red squirrel for that. They have different strategies, but both of them are harvest an awful lot of seeds each year. Major birds of prey. Mountain lions have actually been collared and studied their ranges on the peaks. And one female at least was shown to, in her home range, encompassed the whole San Francisco peaks. And just finally, the little golden mantle ground squirrel. You'll probably see this guy the next time you're up at the Humphreys trailhead, just getting all fat and happy off of hiker food. All right, and then there's the water story. The peaks truly is a mountain oasis, pulls lots and lots of water, along with the Mogollon Rim, of course. In fact, I was schooled by this very assertively by many meteorologists whom I spoke with. He said it's really the Mogollon Rim that is the big driver in pulling moisture to our area. And that, okay, this map was made by a guy at USGS here, Don Bills. The Coconino Plateau, there's the Grand Canyon. Here's the Mogollon Rim country in here, and then Loop, and then further west to Seligman. If you look at the cooler colors, that's really where the moisture is here. And the peak certainly is the most purple, indicating it pulls 30, 35 inches of precip per year. And even some of the little mountains, Williams, Sitgreaves, and Kendrick, as well as the rim, pull a lot of moisture. Whereas, you know, Loop, single digits, Seligman, barely double digits. So we really are, and this mountain is in a, very special place for water, and we're very lucky. I think the deal is to live by some kind of orographic feature in the days ahead, some place that'll force water out of the sky. And this is just to show elevationally what happens with moisture in the peaks. This shows from near Flagstaff, nearly 7,000 feet through 11,000 feet, how much more precipitation, in this case, snowfall, occurs at the higher elevations. And this is near the top of Snowbowl, where they averaged almost 200 inches of snow per year between 1950 and 2015. So elevation is huge, but boy, that's a lot of water, huh, to be pulling in. And even there have also been interbasin studies, of course, associated with water harvesting for the city. And between 1970 and 1990, the low level or amount of water pulled into the basin was 56 million gallons. And at the high side, one of the highest levels was nearly 600 million gallons of water in a given year. So there's quite a bit of water there. There certainly has been. And this just shows the sort of the distribution of moisture, whether you're, you know, in Snowslide Canyon or down near Flagstaff, that pretty much there's a lot of moisture coming in most months except May and June, which is, we all know how that goes. So anyway, and then some threats. Certainly things are warming, and there's evidence of warming on the mountain itself, overstocked forests from a lack of fire, and now massive fires also from a lack of fire, and elk. Richard Hereford, a geomorphologist here, made these graphics for me showing that for the peaks alone between 1900 and 2010, average temperature levels, minimum temperature levels, and maximum temperature levels are all increasing significantly on the mountain. So that sucks. Anyway, aspens are, you know, very vulnerable in all of this. They are fire-driven species, and when fires come through, they tend to kill conifers, and aspens are able to reign for a while. And it's an endless cycle that they've gone through. So We'll see where that all heads in the days ahead. And they are also, of course, confronted by a major threat from Rocky Mountain elk, which were originally driven extinct here, and then after several efforts reintroduced near Williams, Arizona in the early 1900s, and they have obviously done quite well. They browse aspen stems for food, and they also rub their velvet antlers on them. And just driving up 180 one day with snowy conditions, I was absolutely floored to see the extent of what they do to aspen trees. So they're bad. Fires, the Schultz fire was really the product of a lot of years of lack of fire and overgrown forests. It's a beautiful fire, but burned 14,000 acres with most of it occurring in about 6 hours, and just toasted this whole eastern flank of the peaks. So there's, probably more of that coming down the peaks, down the pike. We shall see. It's a major threat now. And subsequent to that, though, a number of plants that were really marginalized by dense conifer forests have expanded into the open, and they're hoping to hold down the very fragile, steep slopes of Schultz Peak, including bitter chokecherry here, a clonal species, and also aspens. And even in the inner basin, this was interesting. The Schultz fire came over the rim, the south rim of Lockett Meadow, and was headed down, and it could have been a phenomenal hit for the inner basin. The Forest Service built a fire line at the base of this slope in the inner basin that totally stopped this fire. And what happened is that it burned away all the conifers, as you can see, and guess who's coming back in? And this photo is actually kind of old. There were, the aspens are much, much taller now. So, all right, and I have talked almost too much. Many, many people helped, of course, and with all good things, including a lot of Sedona folks. And anyway, it's an amazing mountain. It's an amazing book. And if you have any questions, I hope you will get them to me now. I'm ready.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much, Gwen. We do have a number of questions. The first one, in approximately what year do they think the peaks had their major eruption, blowing off the higher cone to give us the series of peaks that we have now? Was there one event or were there many?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, there were certainly a lot of eruptions, and but in terms of the loss of the cone, it's very controversial. We know that that the last layer lava flow to come out of the cone was about 500,000 years old. Let's see. Sugarloaf is 90,000 years old. So somewhere between 500,000 years old and 90,000 years old, the cone came down. Some people think it was a major explosion, kind of like Mount St. Helens, which actually was pretty interesting. If you kind of look at the story on that, Mount St. Helens initially collapsed too, part of its cone or face, and that opened up a gas vent that led to an explosion secondarily. But the explosion that flattened spruce fir forests for 250 square miles all around Mount St. Helens. We don't know. I wish we did. And I know somebody who's kind of studying deposits that may have been flung as far as Antelope Hills up north of Flagstaff. But the jury, unfortunately, is still out on that one. Sorry.
Another question is, what other places do bristlecone live?
Well, that's a great one. Another species occurs in the Great Basin. And again, some of those individuals have been aged at 4,000 and 5,000 years old. This particular bristlecone pine, ours, occurs through the Rockies, though. It occurs through a lot of the Rocky Mountains, and probably in the Intermountain West as well. I'm not honestly sure, but certainly as far south as the peaks from the Rockies.
God, somebody who's obviously versed in geology, I understand compression between tectonic plates forming mountains, but spreading also occurs and is thought to be the source of basin and range features and also the width of the Verde Valley. I know this isn't related to the San Francisco peaks, but in your work, did you come on geological spreading?
No, I can't say I did. I know that, the Great Basin was really interesting in terms of the compaction when the Pacific plate was crowding in on it, and then subduction leading to mountain rising. And then, the expansion, which has led to the block faulting. That's certainly a spreading thing, but manifested as block faulting rather than something else. And there I have really said all I should even think about trying to say about geology.
You mentioned the 3 endemic species that are in the tundra zone. Are any of those species threatened by global warming?
I think that's a fair guess. These are, at this point, think about the size of the tundra, 1,200 acres. That's pretty small. And as things warm, those species won't have any place to go. So there's the San Francisco ragwort, a beautiful, graceful buttercup. And then the last species is actually a parasite. It's a mistletoe that parasitizes blanking, parasitizes bristlecone pine. So bristlecone pine is struggling in the upper peaks from drought and subsequent insect outbreaks and stuff. So I'd say they're all at risk. I think that's totally a fair statement.
Are there any of your favorite hikes in the peaks that you would suggest to people?
Oh, absolutely. They're all just fantastic. The north side of the peaks is amazing to go up Bear or Abbinaw Canyon and down Bear Jaw. You get a really good look at what avalanches do in Abbinaw Canyon. It's just amazing. In the last 10 or 15 years, totally cleared out, and it's a big meadow now, kind of like what you see here with Perry's Primrose. Just these places are opened up by avalanches and get to support diversity of flowers and stuff like that. So this is Snowslide Canyon featured here. That's a wonderful hike too. So Abbinaw Bear Jaw, up the Inner Basin anywhere, but up Snowslide, even up top Doyle Saddle and all, and up to Agassiz is amazing. The Weatherford Trail is amazing. Humphreys Trail is amazing. And even just the good old Waterline Road from Schultz Canyon, Schultz Pass up is just absolutely beautiful these days. And now you can see, the Navajo and Hopi reservations and beyond because all the trees burned away. So yeah, those are all just absolutely fantastic. And you'll see a lot of these things on any of those hikes.
Great. Another question, in Utah, in the Wasatch Range, many of the pines are dying off because of insect infestation. Is any of this happening in the San Francisco peaks?
Well, it certainly has, and they're keeping an eye on it. One of the groups I interviewed was a Forest Service group who fly over the region periodically. And I think that'd be a lot of fun, including over the peaks to kind of look at large blocks of forest and, any evidence of outbreaks. What I know is that there were major droughts, in the 1950s and in the early 2000s in the peaks as well as everywhere. And they were major hits to the forests. And one of the consequences was major outbreaks of insects that are associated with a lot of the conifers that that hurt them badly. And that played out, both of those drought events played out for nearly 10 years because the trees become weakened, and then it just begins this cascade of other effects, you know. And the same even with aspen decline, which occurred in the 1990s. This was a really weird one. It involved aspens having leafed out in the spring and then getting nailed by a particularly wicked frost that killed, you know, all of their foliage and stuff. And it just caught them at just the right time. And they went into what's called aspen decline, which again went on for about 10 years with a cascade of other insects and things sort of jumping in on them in their kind of weakened state. So yeah, it's happened, and it will undoubtedly happen again. Although the forest people that I talked to said they feel that regeneration of all the major forest species in the peaks is going really well these days. So that's a little bit of comfort anyway.
Well, on that note, we're a little bit after 6, and we really appreciate all of the information that you've shared with us, the beautiful pictures, and thank you very much for the presentation. And thank you all attendees for joining us. Want to remind you again that our next presentation is Wednesday, October 14th. Jeff Hall from the Lowell Observatory is going to be speaking about expansion efforts at the observatory. And we will have a post with information about how to link in to that webinar on the KSB website. So thank you again, Gwen, very much. And thank you, attendees. All of you have a great evening.
Thank you so much. This was just great. I appreciate it.
All righty.
Bye.
Bye-bye.